Ukrainian and Turkish delegations meet in Istanbul for Russia-Ukraine talks. European officials arrive at Iranian consulate in Istanbul for nuclear deal talks. And US President Donald Trump departs Abu Dhabi, concluding Gulf visit. These were the headlines, the news in detail. US, Russian and Turkish delegations have convened in Istanbul to negotiate a potential resolution to ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The talks involve foreign ministers and senior officials taking place at the Lambaja Palace along the Bosphorus Strait. Senior Ukrainian officials, including Chief of Staff Andrei Yermak, Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha, and Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, have met with US counterparts in Istanbul. This meeting, as reported by Yermak in social media, preceded anticipated peace talks with Russia, aiming to address the ongoing conflict. Russian and US delegations have engaged in bilateral talks in Istanbul in preparations for upcoming trilateral peace discussions with Ukraine. The US delegation included Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Ambassador to Turkey Tom Barak, and Special Representative for Ukrainian General Keith Kellogg. The Russian side was represented by Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzin, Deputy Defense Minister Alexander Fomin, GRU Chief Igor Kostenkov, and delegation head Vladimir Medinsky. Russian President Vladimir Putin has proposed resuming direct negotiations with Ukraine in Istanbul. This move marks the first face-to-face talks in 3 years. The Russian delegation will be led by President Vladimir Medinsky. Direct negotiations between Russian and Ukrainian delegations have officially begun in Istanbul, as both sides seek a breakthrough in efforts to end the war. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan underscored the importance of heading international appeals for peace, particularly from US President Donald Trump and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He stressed that the responsibility now rests with both nations to choose between continued conflict or a path to peace. Fidan called for every opportunity to be used to secure a ceasefire in Ukraine, adding that Istanbul talks should pave the way for a summit between Russian and Ukrainian leaders. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister has stated that Russia's agreement to a complete ceasefire would signal their willingness to engage in constructive dialogue. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister stated that they require tangible decisions from Russia, particularly regarding an unconditional ceasefire for at least 30 days. He emphasized that Russia is at a stage where it needs to demonstrate its seriousness. Additionally, the minister mentioned that they agreed with the Turkish and US delegations in Istanbul on the necessity of accelerating the peace process, noting that they held a productive meeting with both delegations. And for more analysis, we now move to Salma Marwan in our newsroom.
Thank you, Mona. And for further analysis, we're joined from Moscow by the political science professor, Dr. Ammar Qanem. Dr. Ammar, thank you so much for joining us. And delving right in, how significant is this first face-to-face negotiation between Russia and Ukraine in over 3 years for achieving a lasting ceasefire?
Greetings to everyone. Undoubtedly, this long-awaited step can actually lead to stopping the war. But today we have a little different reality compared to the first negotiations that took place also in Istanbul in 2022. We have a different military geographics that are completely different compared to the condition before. We have U.S. intervention regarding how to address this crisis and how to deal with Russia. And we also have the European party that is very stubborn and want to continue the military operations, and they are the only supporter now for Ukraine regarding the political and military escalation. This step, if addressed correctly by Kiev, will be the survival for Ukraine and for the European party, who have made a lot of mistakes politically recently.
Now, with the United States in the picture, what are the main obstacles likely to affect the success of these trilateral talks involving the United States, Ukraine, and Russia?
There aren't direct negotiations between the three sides, but there is the mediation and Turkish existence facilitating the talks. But we have seen a statement by the Secretary of State of the U.S. That he's not very optimistic with these talks after the Ukrainian side stalled the negotiations, and he stressed that this conflict will not be resolved except with direct meeting between Trump and Putin. And this means that the crisis, as I have stated before, is a geopolitical crisis directly linked to the security and the geopolitical interests of Russia and the United States with its Western cluster. So the conflict is a lot broader than that, and there is a U.S. desire to reach a ceasefire or reach a solution, and it's playing the role of the mediator, but essentially they led this alliance against Putin for 3 years, politically and military, and the U.S. is still giving Ukraine weapons and intelligence information. And this is a complete security equation in the European region, and we can see that this equation is flawed regarding the relations between Europe and the United States. Undoubtedly, these talks are very positive steps if Ukraine commits to what will be agreed upon later on.
Now, speaking of the Turkish mediation, how influential is Turkey's role as the host and mediator in facilitating progress during these negotiations?
I don't think that Turkey can actually affect the course of negotiations. We have seen some pressure, and the Turkish media talking about the Turkish pressures on Zelensky to take part in these talks. But personally, I see Istanbul and Turkey as a platform that is appropriate for all the parties to meet there, and they are very symbolic regarding the first meetings were held also in Istanbul, and Kremlin regards these negotiations as completing the first negotiations that took place in April 2022. And we have seen also that Turkey is trying to keep the balance in their relations, and we wouldn't forget that Turkey is a member in the NATO, and it enjoys very good relations with Russia they isolate the issues that they're dealing with. Ukraine is different from they are dealing with Russia. There are energy supply chain between Russia and Turkey, and Turkey is committing to the principle of non-bias.
Now, assessing Russia's strategy here, how realistic is Russia's proposed resumption of direct talks, and what might Moscow's strategic goals be in these negotiations?
First off, there is a clear intention and a determination to come up with results, most important of which reaching a political solution for this crisis, and not for only the understanding of a ceasefire as proposed by the Ukrainian side and its supporters from Europe. We are talking about a new reality today. There are demands and claims, and Ukraine has agreed to not join the NATO regarding the volume of the Ukrainian army and how it's armed, and among other issues. Today we're facing a new reality, and this is what also desired by Russia, which is approving the regions that are annexed to Russia based on referenda. These districts now, since 2014, and after the political process, 4 districts were annexed to Russia. This is a principle for Russia, and they are requesting the recognition of these Russian districts. And these will be excuses for any military operation in the future.
From Moscow, that was the political science professor, Dr. Ammar Qnews. Thank you so much for joining us here on Q News and for all the information you provided us with. And now we go back to Mona in our studio.
Thank you so much, Salma. And back to our news. And the Kremlin has said that a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump is essential, but would require significant preparation and must lead to concrete outcomes. The statement follows Trump's recent remarks expressing readiness to meet Putin. The Kremlin emphasized the importance of such a summit for both US-Russia relations and wider international and regional issues, including the crisis in Ukraine. The Kremlin added that Russia's delegation remains in close contact with Moscow, with President Putin receiving real-time updates on the negotiations. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has called for intensified sanctions on Russia, particularly targeting the energy sector. Zelensky expressed hope for achieving agreements in Istanbul and empowered his delegation to make decisions. He also emphasized a genuine opportunity to end the conflict fairly and criticized the low representation of the Russian delegation, noting that Russian President Vladimir Putin declined to attend the negotiations. And now we move on to the US-Iran nuclear talks update. A convoy believed to carry European officials has arrived at the Iranian consulate in Istanbul for discussions regarding the stalled 2015 nuclear deal. That comes as senior diplomats are aiming to prepare for an anticipated 5th round of the US-Iranian negotiations. The earlier talks were postponed due to E3 concerns. Diplomats decided to proceed to maintain dialogue with Iran and clarify the vision for a new nuclear agreement. Iran's deputy foreign minister has stated that he discussed the nuclear negotiations process with European officials regarding talks with Washington. That comes as Iran maintains a cautious yet hopeful stance in US-Iran talks, seeking diplomatic engagement while emphasizing the need for tangible outcomes and respect for its sovereignty. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has met with the national security advisors from the United Kingdom, France and Germany to discuss matters concerning Ukraine and Iran. Meanwhile, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators were in Istanbul for what it considered their first direct peace talks in over 3 years, amid pressures from the U.S. President Donald Trump to resolve Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II. Earlier, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has confirmed that U.S. President Donald Trump considers reaching a nuclear agreement with Iran a top priority. Rubio described the current moment as critical for Washington, citing Iran's advanced uranium enrichment levels. He also stressed that the U.S. offer on the table will not remain open indefinitely. U.S. President Donald Trump has departed Abu Dhabi, concluding his Gulf visit. During his trip, he announced an agreement between the United States and the United Arab Emirates to facilitate the Gulf nation purchases of advanced artificial intelligence semiconductors from U.S. companies. Finalized on May 15th, this deal represents a significant achievement for the United Arab Emirates, which seeks to balance ties with both the U.S. and China. And now we move on to the latest developments in Gaza. Palestinian medical sources reported that more than 150 people were killed or injured in Israeli airstrikes targeting residential homes in Beit Lahia and Jabalia, northern Gaza. At least 10 homes were hit, most of them occupied. Dozens remain trapped under rubble as rescue efforts are hampered by destroyed roads. Gaza's health ministry said around 250 Palestinians have been killed across the Strip in the past 48 hours. Explosions were seen early Friday morning on the Gazan side of the Israel-Gaza border following multiple blasts reported the previous night. At least 114 Palestinians were killed in Israeli airstrikes on Thursday, according to health officials in Gaza. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio expressed concern over the worsening humanitarian situation in the Strip. His remarks come as the United States, alongside Arab mediators, continue to push for a ceasefire agreement. President Donald Trump was visiting the region as part of efforts to support diplomatic negotiations. Israeli media report that last night's heavy bombardment of northern Gaza is a prelude to potential ground incursion involving armored forces. An Israeli security source told local outlets that the intensified attacks aim to pressure Hamas into accepting a final deal before the war escalates further. Now, as the blockade on Gaza enters its third month, a deepening hunger crisis is pushing millions to the brink, with children and most vulnerable suffering the most under Israel's continued restrictions.
The Israeli blockade on Gaza stretches into its 7th month. A worsening hunger crisis is gripping the besieged enclave. Families across the Gaza Strip are facing relentless food shortages, with many struggling to feed their children even a single meal a day. Israel halted all entry of goods and supplies into Gaza on March 2nd, after the collapse of the first phase of a temporary ceasefire with Hamas. Attacks resumed on March 18th, intensifying what has already become a humanitarian catastrophe. With border crossings sealed and no humanitarian corridors functioning, the World Food Programme announced in late April it had exhausted its food stocks in Gaza. Community kitchens that once served 500,000 meals daily have shut down due to a lack of supplies. Aid agencies now warn of a looming famine. The blockade's impact is most devastating on Gaza's children. At least 65,000 have shown symptoms of malnutrition, and the number of reported child deaths from hunger and related illnesses has continued to rise. Medical staff report rising numbers of patients with chronic illnesses like diabetes and hypertension arriving at hospitals with deteriorating conditions, directly linked to the absence of nutrition and clean water. Recovery from war-related injuries is also being delayed due to malnutrition. The health sector is nearing collapse. The Palestinian Red Crescent says it's run out of medication for chronic diseases and lacks nutritional supplements and infant formula. UN agencies warn that over 2 million people, nearly the entire population, are facing acute food insecurity. Pregnant women and infants are among the most vulnerable. The World Health Organization found that up to 20% of surveyed pregnant and breastfeeding women are now malnourished, with hospitals reporting a sharp rise in premature births tied to undernourishment. Meanwhile, Gaza's fields remain off-limits, and fishing has been blocked, cutting off traditional food sources. With no aid entering since March, humanitarian officials say the crisis is entering a critical stage, one that threatens long-term consequences for an already shattered population. As the blockade continues, and with no clear sign of international relief, Gaza's people are left to battle hunger, disease, and war, with dwindling hope for survival.
Ben Cohen, co-founder of Ben & Jerry's, has been arrested after taking part in a pro-Palestine protest that disrupted a U.S. Senate committee hearing on health care. The incident occurred during a session of the Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, where Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. was delivering testimony. Activists interrupted the proceedings by shouting slogans from the gallery, momentarily halting the session. Cohen joined the protest to criticize U.S. military support for Israel's war in Gaza, linking it to cuts in domestic health care programs. An artistic performance in the Italian alpine town of Brixton marked the start of the United Nations International Day of Light on Friday. Italian artist Stefano Cagol lit a series of symbolic SOS torches in front of the town's cathedral in a global call to reflect on the evolving relationship between humans and robots. Titled "We Own the Futures," the performance featured a humanoid robot alongside the artist, using light, fire and imagery to highlight the need for trust between people and intelligent machines. The event concluded with a powerful visual moment as Cagol and the robot looked to the sky while NASA solar footage was projected onto the cathedral, symbolizing shared future shaped by both humanity and technology. Two giant panda cubs were captured on video playing with colorful toys at the Shenzhen base of China Conservation and Research Center for Giant Pandas in Sichuan Province, southwest China. The cubs born in 2024 to pandas Kan Kan and Ji Du are part of the center's environmental enrichment program, an initiative designed to encourage natural behaviors and support the animals' physical and mental health. The Chengdu-based facility is internationally recognized for its role in the conservation of endangered species, including the giant panda and red panda. It also serves as a center for scientific research, public education, and ecotourism. Well, that brings us to the end of our news bulletin. Here is what we've been covering. US, Ukraine, and Turkish delegations meet in Istanbul for Russia-Ukraine talks. European officials arrive at Iranian consulate in Istanbul for nuclear deal talks. And US President Donald Trump departs Abu Dhabi, concluding Gulf visit. This concludes our news bulletin for the hour. Don't forget to follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at Qnews EGY to stay informed. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.